joining us. It's a good morning from me here in Wales. A very early morning, Stephen, you all right? It's 3 a.m. I suppose I should also greet good afternoon to those of you joining us from elsewhere, and certainly good evening to our first speaker, Michael. I believe it's 9 p.m. for you over there. I'm really excited to be chairing this session. And we've a very interesting set of papers ahead for this session, all on the overriding theme of pedagogy. Our first speaker, Michael, joins us from the Cayman Islands, and will be speaking of his intervention in implementing the Pecha Kucha method, which I'm really looking forward to hearing more about, Michael. And I believe you'd first given thought to this back in around about 2016. So great to hear more about that today. Over to you, Michael. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Well, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, whether it's Saturday or Friday or whatever day everybody is in. My presentation is going to be looking at blending together two particular methods of the Pecha Kucha and some speed networking, which I think is quite interesting for what's happened this year with the coronavirus outbreak and our move from the traditional face-to-face classroom to online. I think using this method has certainly helped some of my students get through that difficult transition phase. So just to give you a little bit of background, I've been at the Truman Bodden Law School here in the Cayman Islands. This will be coming up to my 4th year, where in the Cayman Islands, if you don't know, is just south of Cuba and between kind of Jamaica and Mexico. We are just an independent law school. We stand alone, as it were, here. We're not part of a larger university in Cayman, but we are affiliated to the University of Liverpool. So we teach in English, LLB, as validated by Liverpool. So we are very much connected with the UK in that sense. So I'm sure most people are familiar with this image of the learning pyramid, and it's always worth reminding ourselves how astounding, how little goes in one ear and goes out the other side immediately from a lecture, with the average retention rates from a lecture being 5%. And we give out all this directed reading, and that only has a retention rate of 10%. So I was trying to, these screens are moving along too quickly here, sorry. I'm trying to improve the students' learning by getting them to participate as students, as producers. So using some of these things further down the pyramid, of getting them to engage with something audiovisual, getting them to do something as a demonstration, and practice. Practice, I think, was one important thing here that the speed networking does with the Pecha Kucha and speed dating. And also trying to get them to teach each other a little bit. Not so much teach each other, but more just facilitate this kind of revision environment rather than the flipped classroom experience. I didn't want them teaching new material to each other. It was more about kind of going over material that I've already given to them. So for that reason, this little graphic here just shows the relationship between the student and me, the teacher. That there is my material, my lectures where I've talked. We teach in 2-hour blocks. So for me, teaching 2 hours with lots of slides and lots of text and lots going in one ear and coming straight out the other, there is the opportunity here for the students to be producers and create something different to what I've created, but very much related. So it's a cyclical thing, I guess, is that I'm using stuff that I've taught before, and I'm giving it to them, and I'm getting them to repurpose it and give it back to other students. And the other thing that I'm also trying to encourage in this is a bit of it's not a skills module that I'm teaching, but I do want to focus on the skills that we've taught on the LLB program in students' previous modules. So I think part of the key to a good Pecha Kucha presentation is a lot about the planning and the preparation as well as the performance. This is kind of what a Pecha Kucha session might look like if you're drafting it out. For those who aren't familiar, Pecha Kucha, or I think actually the Japanese pronunciation is Pecha Kucha, but I would stand corrected on that. It's a very fast-paced presentation. It's a little bit like a lightning presentation that is becoming quite common. but it's based around these 20 slides, not shown all at once, but shown consecutively. This graphic is just showing how you might plan one out. But 20 slides, and for each slide, the speaker has 20 seconds in which they can talk, and then it would move on automatically. Which is why my slides are jumping around at the moment all the time, because I think this presentation is set to 20 slides per second, so I'm at fault there. And the other thing about Pecha Kucha is that it should be very visual. Each of these coloured post-it notes here should just have a single image rather than text. And I think as academics, we're all quite guilty of overloading the PowerPoint with lots of heavy text, especially in legal education, especially when there are cases and there are quotes. There is legislation, and legislation can be quite long-winded sometimes. We tend to put a lot on those slides. We tend to talk for anything up to 10 minutes, I guess, per slide. You know, we can dwell on things. And I think that's perhaps one of the reasons why things go in one ear and come out the other side with the 5% retention rate. So the graphic, I think, is just a stimulation, and part of the learning opportunity and part of the student producer angle is that students have to think of some image, think of something relevant and something that kind of visually represents what it is they're talking about, whether it's a part of a case or a piece of legislation or just something theoretical or something in the conclusions that has some meaning, something to hang it on. And because this was a revision exercise, I think that visual stimulus will help going into the exam, because they might just be able to associate that image with some of the key points or some of the visual and audio connections that come together. But the other part of looking at this full on, as you can see here, the 20 slides, this graphic has grouped them into kind of 4 groups of 4. So some of this was about time management, and some of this was about the skill of the presentation. Every presentation has a beginning and a middle and an end, obviously, but what goes into that beginning and middle and end? So this could be 4 slides for the beginning, a couple of big middle chunks and kind of 4 slides for the end, or it could be anything. But the point is that there maybe needs to be a few slides as a group to get across maybe one point. So if you were talking about a case, you might take 3 or 4 slides to go through that case, because you've only got 20 seconds per slide, and that really isn't a lot at all. But it's very good skill. It's certainly good fitting in with our advocacy sessions, where students have to stand up and make a presentation to the bench and not bore the audience to death. So for that reason, I'll move on as well. What else is interesting about this is the speed dating aspect. So the Pecha Kucha presentation, 20 slides, 20 seconds, that's normally delivered as a kind of stand up and speak to the audience. Some students found that a little bit daunting. What I wanted to do was have them work in pairs, as I call it speed dating. I don't use that vocabulary with them because they don't particularly like the word speed dating. It doesn't fit with academic study. But the idea is that there would be somebody giving a Pecha Kucha presentation, sat at a table with their laptop, and they would have their date sat next to them. They would have a participant listening to this. So the student would produce their content, deliver it to a single person in the audience who would listen. They were encouraged to take notes and ask questions at the end. Nobody ever wants to get interrupted in a Pecha Kucha presentation. It's so kind of rigid and fast-paced. Questions at the end. So they would deliver this very much like a speed dating. They would have their patter, they would deliver what they have to deliver, and then a bell would ring and everybody would move around into a different table and they would do it again. And I think there's a huge benefit in this practice rehearsal, do it again, do it again, do it again. And I think those 3 occasions are probably the optimum amount of time. So here is what it kind of would look like from the view from the ceiling. The dark blobs are the stationary participants. So these are the people giving a Pecha Kucha presentation, and the white blobs around the outside would be the audience, who would rotate around. And the idea here is that every student would deliver a presentation 3 times, and every participant would listen to 3 different presentations, as well as delivering their own. So they would get exposure to 4 kind of topic areas. which, depending on your numbers, we have quite a small law school here, so I never really needed to worry about numbers, but you might have to have this arrangement repeated around the classroom, as it were, or you might have to have kind of groups of 2 going around each table and listening to one presenter. But there's different ways in which you can multiply this up. I think it's scalable. It would work with a class of 6, it would work with a class of 600 if you were prepared and efficient. And of course, that's the key for the students, is to be prepared and be efficient. So I think if we can do that, so can they. And as I said, the speed dating word I didn't think went down very well, so I call it speed networking. And I think students can see a match with this as to how they might work in the real world, about making new business relationships, about listening to the elevator pitch, about going around to different people and listening to things. But I also wanted to spice it up. And the way in which I kind of tried to spice it up and be a bit lively is that I introduced some kind of points system. So this made it a bit of fun. This brought in a little bit of informality. The Pecha Kucha format is very formal and very rigid, but by having the option to take notes at the end and ask questions at the end, gave it a little bit more flexibility. But the points system was such that the participants that were listening to these Pecha Kucha presentations, they would be given maybe a dozen or so M&Ms or whatever candy you've got kicking around. And at the end of listening to everybody, they would decide who deserved more points. So they would give out some of their M&Ms or some of their sweeties into different tubs with people's names on, and people would win points and prizes for doing that. Or you could have a competition for who had the funniest graphic or who kept to the best timekeeping. So you can kind of liven it up a little bit with something informal, just to make it a bit more fun. And I think that really helped once we'd moved to the online delivery after the coronavirus outbreak. It gave our online classes a little bit of reality. It gave a little bit of humor, and it gave a little bit of collegiate atmosphere. I think it brought everybody together after we'd been apart for some time. So the real key, I guess, to Pecha Kucha is this practice and presentation. So again, the skills involved, the kind of softer skills or the legal skills in just giving presentations and being concise, keeping to time and moving on were great. And I like this quote. I'm just going to throw this quote in to show that sometimes words can work well in a Pecha Kucha presentation, of a little quote. And this is what I tried to keep in mind the whole way through about, I'm not just teaching people, I'm wanting them to get involved, especially when we're teaching at a distance. Nobody signed up for an online law degree with us. We just ended up with one. And this just shows you a little bit about kind of how things panned out for us during this previous semester too. We had pretty much a normal run for 7 weeks of face-to-face teaching. So this again was in the second semester. So I think we had quite a good cohort of students who were well knitted together. But in week 7, we had a bit of a local fire. The local rubbish tip caught fire and caused a lot of problems locally because we don't have too many roads. So a lot of lectures were cancelled in that week 7. So we kind of had weeks 7, 8, 9 and 10 all disrupted. So there was a substantial amount of teaching that was still to be delivered during that period. But we then had quite a nice comfortable break at Easter with 3 weeks off. And then we came back into this revision session, which, as I say, the Pecha Kucha I had planned for delivering face-to-face. But with a few tweaks and things, we managed to make it go online. And then we had our exams coming in afterwards. So it was nicely timed, I think, for bringing everyone together. But this slide, I just want to quickly point out, is just evidence that I'd done this before. As Emma mentioned, it's not a new thing for me. So I think that really helped for me that I'd done this before. I knew what I was doing. I knew how it should work in the classroom. So for me, moving it to the online environment was much easier because I knew how it should look. And I also knew how to scaffold, because I've been a fan for quite some time of Gilly Salmon, who's currently a professor at Liverpool, ironically, where we have our LLB validated. But Gilly Salmon's model, you can find it online at gillysalmon.com. Her eTivities model shows this 5 stages. that I think is really useful, just to use as a visual here, about making sure that you scaffold and prepare your students so that they can get into a system a bit like this conference, to be quite honest. There is a platform, there is the sending and receiving and messaging. People feel involved, people feel connected. But it's this knowledge construction where the students are the producers. They are constructing this knowledge at stage 4. And if you don't have 1, 2, and 3 all lined up, then we're not going to get that knowledge construction facilitated and working, and we're not ever going to get to stage 5, which is the development and the responding to all of these things. So I found that really useful and would always kind of advocate that for any activity, even if it's blended learning with your students in the classroom, supported by a virtual learning environment. So my conclusions, because I think I am kind of running close to time now here, is really that, I said this before, we didn't intend to run an online course. But I think that the students actually enjoyed, as they have in previous years, I found that students enjoyed producing something like Pecha Kucha, and they enjoyed the formality of being holden to 20 seconds and 20 slides. But they also felt that doing it one-to-one and face-to-face gave it a little bit more of informality. So they were producing something. It was something of value. I encouraged them to record it, like we're doing with this conference, and make it available afterwards to kind of go over and recap. And yeah, they were learning from each other, learning in a revision context rather than learning from ab initio from the beginning. But it also kind of brought up the presentation skills too. So I think I should finish there, because I think that's my 15 minutes up.
Excellent. Thank you ever so much, Michael. We really appreciate that and sharing in particular your feelings on the way that went. I'm bursting with questions and observations, but I will be fair to our audience. We've already received one question from a delegate, Esther Erlings. Thank you very much. Esther's asked, at which point did the participants get to ask their questions, and how much time was available for that?
The questions were at the end. I was very strict about this because I've done quite a few Pecha Kucha sessions myself, and the worst thing is people interrupting you because you're on such a time frame. So questions at the end. And again, that sort of time management as an academic, you can only get through so many presentations in a particular session. So properly timed up, a Pecha Kucha is 6 minutes and 40 seconds. I think that's right. But you can only really do kind of 4 in an hour. Which sounds like a bit of a waste of time, but people need to move around, and the more discussion the better. It's a bit like the conferences that you go to. The better ones are with the longer lunch breaks and the longer coffee breaks, not just for coffee and lunch, but for finding people and talking to them and making connections and having a discussion. So I built in almost as much time between as the actual Pecha Kucha sessions, because these were when students could reflect on how well they did, make some adjustments, because they'd be doing the same thing again in another kind of 5 or 10 minutes. So they could have a dialogue between each other with questions going both ways. So hopefully that answers the question.
Yes, thank you. So to my questions, there's a lot there, and I think you've picked up on a lot of the kind of skills, how enriching this experience is for the students in terms of skills. I can see that you've picked up on, in particular, the professionalism element and how this prepares them for networking. And I wonder if you've considered perhaps even embedding an element of this in relation to your summative assessments, such that they undertake some piece of reflective learning, maybe about the actual skills that they have picked up through the exercise, and not simply the knowledge acquisition.
Yeah, I think I agree with you there. I think that would be a good next step, because we are. This is something I've done in various different levels, kind of level 4, 5, and 6, and for the very substantive modules. It's a great way to get through that revision. It's almost a kind of symbiotic relationship of students buy into it, not because it's assessed or because they're going to get marks from it, but because they're actually helping one another, and they can see that, well, if I have to learn how to present this, I'm going to be really hot at answering an exam question on this. And if I really pay attention to these other very short 6-minute snippets, I'll get a lot of stuff from them. So it's quite a good way for that kind of deep learning, not kind of broad. Again, there's a management issue here for me as the academic, making sure that we've got enough breadth and spread across the different students and the different topics. So I would tend to kind of allocate topics and say, well, that's maybe a bit big. It worked well with our employment module, so I'll just give some examples there. So, for example, restraint of trade. It is a kind of nice enough area that you could maybe say, well, you could do a Pecha Kucha on restraint of trade, but don't go any broader. Certainly don't start talking about anything else that's similar or connected. Stick to that and go deep. Don't go broad. Go really, really deep as you can on a narrow area. Some students would even do a Pecha Kucha on just one case. Just one narrow area, but really going to town on it, really giving the kind of the ins and outs and the detail of it, not factually, but evaluatively as well. But yeah, it could be assessed. I don't see why not.
Yeah, and any element of participative learning or underpinned by participative or active pedagogy entails that deeper learning, of course, in any case. I'm particularly interested in the way that you've achieved kind of the embedding of digital literacy by doing this, by taking it online as well. And I think there's probably much more in terms of the professionalism, again, that can be drawn out of that for the students to be realising actively what it is they're gaining from it, not merely knowledge and understanding, this very useful revision exercise, but also what they're gaining in terms of their digitalisation of their studies. And in my own work, I'm really curious at the moment about this continuum between social digital literacy and this professional digital literacy. So it's really interesting to see your inspiration from Liverpool there about having these layers, because there's going to be some element of wanting to bring that social digital literate student through to the professional environment, not realizing actually that it's really important that we retain that social element. And of course this exercise very much speaks to the importance of that.
Yes, yeah, and I think the students got that as well, because they this could have been dropped. We could have just said, this is another thing to do, let's just put it to one side because we're in uncharted territory, as the phrasing goes. It's something we could have easily just said, let's forget about it, but they really enjoyed it. They thoroughly felt engaged, and I think that's where the speed network comes in as the professional angle rather than the speed dating, which sounds a bit too kind of informal and friendly. So I think that kind of helped with part of this scaffolding as well. But so some got kind of dressed up. I mean, here I am 9 o'clock on a Friday night in kind of work clothes. So some appeared very professional for it, much more than they would have done in the classroom, because they were conscious of, the backdrop behind you, how they looked. I mean, I haven't had a haircut for 4 months, but they really were trying to kind of put themselves across in the best light. And I did say to them, look, can we record these? Can we record them and replay them? Because I know you wouldn't let me do that in the classroom with a video camera in front of you. So that's something that I think I'm going to explore in future years, having experienced this kind of, oh yeah, everyone just gets on Zoom and we can just, they'll be fine. I think there's lessons to be learned for going back to the face-to-face.
Oh, absolutely. And it's really interesting that they're willing and quite keen on the idea of getting dressed up. And it's interesting because we're exploring at the moment the barriers that are in place, I guess, between us and the students in moving online. But it seems that sometimes in some situations, if we build this around creating an online learning community for them, then they will actively participate.
Yeah, there was something active. It wasn't just a talking head. It wasn't just lecture notes. It was something to work towards and get excited about and enjoy doing. I got a lot of good feedback from it afterwards, saying that they enjoyed doing it.
Excellent, thank you very much. Apologies, delegates, for dominating the questions there. Just a lot to discuss and really inspiring work that you're doing, Michael. Thank you very much for your contribution.